In this lesson, I'm going to show you a few examples of how to write a class in Swift. So let's get started. I'm going to go to Xcode, and in here I'm going to start a new command line tool, and it's going to be a Swift language, and I'm going to call it Classes in Swift. Perfect. So here, the first example is actually going to be class, and I let Xcode autocomplete for me, so I know what I should do. I have to give it a name. I can or can, not give it a superclass, and I have to give it some code. So let's go ahead and write that. I'm going to say my first class is a user class. And what does my user class have? It has a variable called name of the type string. Keep in mind that I'm making my name an implicitly forced unwrapped, which means name must be there. Then I'm going to say var. Let's say it has something called photo name, and that's an optional. Maybe my user doesn't have a photo. I have a variable, call it UID. That's my user's unique ID essentially. That's going to be a string that it must be there. I cannot not have it. And then I'm going to have another thing, let's say var height. All right, and this one is going to be an integer, and that one should be there as well. And that's about that. We now have a class user that has some attributes. Let's go ahead and build an instance of it. So this is how to make the class up here, and this is the body of it. And now we're going to make one instance, an instance. I'm going to say var, I'm going to call it my user, Amir user, is of the type user, and it's going to be a brand new user. And then I can say Amir user dot name is going to be a string. Amir user dot height, it has to be an integer value, let's say 200. I could or not give it a photo name. Maybe I don't want to have a photo name. And I'm going to say Amir user dot UID is going to be a set of different characters. And that's about that. Now we have a user, that user is of the type class user. I could go ahead and say print, and what I want to print is username is, and then I would have one of these interpolations, and I would say Amir user dot name, and I have to unwrap it because it's an optional. So let's go ahead, and now I'm going to see it that says username is exactly the way we expected it to be. I should show you something that's completely irrelevant, but it doesn't hurt. For producing unique values in Swift, you could use this UUID dot UUID string, and now it will produce a unique value. So I could say UID is, and I would get the UID, and it will give me a unique ID for this user. That's a unique number, that unique combination that Swift produces. Sometimes when you are, writing things internally, you would depend on this. So that was our first example of making a class. In my next example, I'm actually going to change this bit, the one that we do an initialization on our class, and give it a custom init. So I'm going to go in here, say init, and that's like a default, class of every default method of every class. And if you add it, it means you're overriding the init. So I'm going to say initialize with this. Let's call it input name. That's a string, and then input photo name. That's a string optional. Maybe it is there or maybe it is nil. And then input UID. That could be a string. I'm going to change this in a second. So if you're typing, just hold on for a second. And input height. All right, and input height is going to be an integer. Now, why did I say I have to change the input UID? Because it's most likely that for something like a UID, you wouldn't know it when you are creating a new user. If you're making a new user, you probably know their height, you know their name. If they have a photo, you know them. And you might want the compiler to produce the UID for you. So I'm not going to actually input a UID. I'm going to say at the init time, do this. Say self.name is input name. So when you are initializing a new one with this method, set its name to whatever name I give you. If let's call it input photo name is input photo name, it means if there is an input photo name, then also make a photo name to be input photo name, and or self photo name, that's really irrelevant, you could use it or not. I kind of prefer using the self. And then self height is input height. So when we call this method, we introduce three values in it: a name, a photo name, and a height, and then our object gets produced based on those. But what happens to the UID? We are producing it, but we don't have a UID. So what I have to do is I have to manually add that to my init as well, which is I'm gonna say self.uid will become uuid dot uuid string. Perfect. So now when we initialize, everything works the way we want it. Now how are we going to use this initialize method? I'm going to go here to Amir user. When I'm making an instance, I'm going to say, well, user. And now it says, oh, user can only be initialized with this method because that init has been overridden. So I'm going to say, oh, so the name is Amir. Input photo name, I'm going to say nil because it is an optional that can be nil. I'm going to say I don't have a photo name. And I'm going to say the height is 180. And that's about that. So I don't need any of these guys anymore because at the initialization, everything has happened. So really quickly, once again, I'm going to change my format so we can see it a little bit easier. Maybe I bring this here, which is a more common practice, like that. And now if I bring that one down there, up there as well. Okay, so now we have everything. We have a user that has all these three, and then we have an init for it that initializes it. And when I use the init, I'm going to provide it with a name, no photo name, and a height. So far, we wrote a class that has some attributes and has an initialize method. Now let's go ahead and write another class that this class can actually translate something for us. Of course, we can't write an entire translator, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to write a class that can translate one single word from English to either French or German languages. Let's see how we're going to do that. I'm going to go in here. I'm going to get myself a little space. I'm going to say I have a class called translate. All right, my translate class has a variable called language, which is a string. So I have this one, and it also has this. It has an init with imp language, which is going to be a string. And whenever we do it, obviously self.language becomes imp language. So far we have actually managed to initialize our translate. And then I'm going to say this. I'm going to say it has a function translate. And what does translate do? It receives a word. So let's say input word is going to be a string. It doesn't give us anything back. What it does do, it has to translate that. How? Depending on what's the language. So I'm going to say if language is, let's say, German, then we assume that that input word is always going to be hello. But you could, write it differently. I'm going to say if language is German, then print hello in German is, and then hello. All right. Else, if that wasn't the case, then I'm gonna say hello in French is, how is it, bonjour, something like that. So let's say how are we going to use that. I'm gonna say give me an object, so where my French is going to be translate initialized with a language called French. And if now from my French I call a method called translate and I translate hello, then if we run this, it is going to show us hopefully hello in French is bonjour. Perfect. And those other things are printed because my other program is still in here, my other class. So once again, really quickly, classes, we declare them with class, and then we have a set of attributes, and we can have an init if we want, and we also can have functions if we need them. And then depending on those, we can do a variety of things. Something really quick about the naming conventions. We often, not often, almost always, we capitalize our class names. So we don't call our class translate, we call it capital T translate. And that's a very common practice. I would suggest that you do that as well. So in case you still need some help with this, I'm going to keep this on the screen for a few seconds. And then after this, I'm going to scroll to the other class, our first class, and keep it here for a few seconds as well. So now these are the two classes. The only thing that really matters is this class, one attribute, init, and then this one, a function. Beyond that, everything is things that we have done in the past, and we will be doing more and more of these in the coming lesson. So until then.